the most significant thing of this leak is that the 30 days notice, So in other words, after the election, essentially, So they don't want to stray into the Democratic administration on this, on the cusp of a very tight election, doesn't want to stray into a situation where Trump can make capital, and Trump, will probably take the Netanyahu side on a lot of issues. So, so they're tying themselves up. As we know, it's a lame duck presidency, and so for the last 2 months we've seen this. We've seen the White House tie itself up in all sorts of ways. They're responding in part to sort of initiatives that are coming out. I mean, the Americans of Israel. There's a general's proposal. A group of retired generals, for example, have suggested ways of avoiding a siege of the north.
Of Gaza?
Yes, I'm talking about Gaza in this sense. And in which you basically create a situation where civilians leave, we don't know exactly where, and you then lay the north under siege, but in a kind of subtle way, and then that phases into a kind of occupation. So so I think the Americans quite like that, and Netanyahu doesn't. Netanyahu doesn't because he thinks there's, inviting other powers to run the military strategy is not a great idea, and then we have Lebanon, So it's which has its own complexities. So what's going to happen next? I'm not sure. But either way, it looks like Biden has essentially said, look, this is going to be out of my hands quite soon.
Yeah. I mean, I had it suggested to me recently by a former diplomat that when Israel begins conflicts, it always does so in the knowledge that there is basically an American clock ticking.
Yes, that's correct.
And that's part of the reason why when Israel begins conflicts, it often does so in quite such a hard fashion, because it knows that it's got a limited amount of time. And that part of the reason why this appears to have sort of degenerated into such a humanitarian nightmare is because the curb that even the Israelis expected simply hasn't come. Do you think there's any sense in that?
Yes, and it's why things are coming out wrong. The optics of it are that America has supplied, or is in the process of supplying, THAAD anti-aircraft missiles, and with a team with the commitment of American instructors and engineers and so on, because it's a very expensive bit of kit, and it would be a natural target for whoever attacked Israel in that situation. And so the subtext of that is that America and Israel have been discussing what would happen after Israel attacked Iran, and the kind of security guarantees that America would provide. That's fair enough. That's been the level of the American-Israeli discourse for a long time. But because of the election, the administration wants to say, but it's not for nothing.
Yeah, sure.
And we want this in return. And the reason for that is it's the opinion polling, especially amongst Democrat voters, has been that they'd like the civilians not to be bombed.
Yeah. Josh, look, before we move on from this, how much do you think Netanyahu cares what even the Americans say? I mean, never mind just pre-election, even post-election. Is he sort of beyond that, or is he still capable of being reined in by the White House, should they so choose?
Well, I don't think he'll ever be beyond it, because fundamentally America has the weapons that Israel needs. And that, as long as that doesn't change, he can't be beyond it. But it's certainly the case that I think he has moved further away from caring about what America thinks than he's ever been before and than previous Israeli leaders. And I think he views this, he sees America as weak, he sees Biden as weak, and he views this as an opportunity for him to take the lead and sort of chart the path that he wants to chart. So I do think he's exposed his own views on America's weakness in recent months, particularly.
Well, look, next up, we're going to be talking about whether David Lamy is up to the job, which is the topic of Roger's column in the paper today. This is Hugo Rifkin here on Times Radio. I'm still joined by Josh Glancy, the editor of the News Review at the Sunday Times, and Roger Boys, the diplomatic editor of the Times. Let's talk about David Lamy. He's already restricted UK arms sales to Israel. This week he's off to China. But in his column in the paper today, Roger, you say these are serious times and we need a serious diplomat at the helm, not lame Lamy. Why is he not up to the job, in your view?
Well, I think for me, anyway, the clinching moment was when he, I think, rushed into an agreement that ceded the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. Mauritius being, first of all, quite a long way away from Chagos, and second, being quite a loyal member of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, the significance of Chagos is military. Diego Garcia is a very important base for the security of the Indian Ocean. It's part of the whole strategy of containing China's growth and control over maritime passages. And it was a strategic ineptitude, really, to allow that to happen. There were other ways around it. And they could have taken time, but he should have taken time. And it was a surrender, as I phrase it anyway, of hard power in return for merely notional soft power gains. That's to say, and that's how he justified it. It was basically, how can we win the trust of the global South if we go against the United Nations General Assembly's rulings on the Chagos Islands. And, we need to stand up, back straight, proudly and so on. But, it's not a good look. It's not a good look. I don't fetishize this first 100 days in government. There's not a great deal you can do in 100 days. Although we managed to defeat Napoleon in 100 days. But anyway.
I mean, not you and me.
No, not you and me. Maybe your dad. There are too many unforced errors. And that's the point.
It's something of a perennial. Whenever there's a new government, the foreign secretary is always not up to scratch at first. Would you say he's, in your view, particularly so?
Yes, I think the accumulation of what's been happening and what he hasn't done. It's not about, people pick on his mastermind performance in 2008, where he forgot which king preceded Henry VIII or something like that. Well, I don't hold that against him. We don't need quizzes as foreign secretary, but we do need some depth, some strategic patience, the ability to listen, and the ability to work through institutions that you mould.
So Nick has been in touch while we're talking, pointing out that his predecessors include Boris Johnson and Liz Truss.
Exactly.
Would you say he's worse than both of them?
Well, it's too early really to judge, but yes.
Why?
I mean, not yes, because I would certainly, if I'd had time, have called for Liz Truss to go. I've met them all. You know, I mean, not Lamy as it happens, but I've met them all.
That's going to be fun when it happens.
And
Josh, David Lamy, he's been talking a good game as relates to the Republicans. He's very keen to show the Republicans that he's sort of on their wavelength. What have you taken from that?
Well, I think Lamy's coming for slightly unfair criticism at this point, and I think the Chagos Islands situation is a little bit more complex than has been reported in the British press. You know, having lost various legal challenges by Mauritius, Britain was in quite a difficult position with Chagos. The Americans actually were very keen to just secure the Diego Garcia base, which has incredibly important strategic assets on it. And as a result, the Americans were quite keen to just cut a deal to ensure that Diego Garcia was protected, which is what Britain then did. So I do think it's a little bit more complex. I don't think it's quite as strategically inept as has been reported. But yeah, Lamy is also keen. He's obviously keen to avoid the mistakes that were made in 2016 when Britain was caught very flat-footed by Trump's victory in the election. The embassy in Washington had not basically prepared for a Trump victory. Obviously, it's probably a 52% chance that Trump wins. So they want to be ready for it. And that means being grown up and having, serious outreach to the Trump camp and making, a pragmatic approach to Donald Trump.
Roger, you write in your column that Lamy, he's talked about a policy of progressive realism. What is progressive realism?
Well, I wish he knew. I think, it's basically the readiness to use military force, if absolutely necessary, in a democratic cause, or as to say, perhaps to get rid of a dictator or whatever. And in that respect, insofar as there's any clarity about this concept at all, it rather resembles neoconservatism. It's essentially the kind of logic that motivated Blair to support the American 2003 intervention in Iraq, and that didn't go well. And Lamy, nota bene, voted in favour of that invasion. So it's.
But Roger, is it not? A realist wouldn't invade Iraq in order to effect regime change. That's quite an idealist thing to do, wouldn't it? Wouldn't a realist think of that as quite a reckless thing to do?
Having considered myself a realist at the time, I certainly considered it quite a reckless thing to do.
Well, yeah. So maybe the term realism was being abused, but either way, it was justified by a sense of we can change the game in the Middle East by showing dictatorships that work against Western interests that they're on the wrong track, and that was framed in realist talk.
Before we leave this, Roger, what's Lamy's next test? How can he redeem himself in your eyes? What comes up next?
You mean after going to China and offering? He's defined, and of course, the whole of this Starmer government is so-called mission-driven. So it's about getting growth, it's about getting investment, and all these things, and that will. So the first test is, can he balance that when he's in China with other issues which should be raised about their human rights records and their ability to fit into the global system. So that's the first challenge. But then there's the Commonwealth Summit, and one of the issues, which is next week, and one of the issues there, one of the big issues probably will be British reparations for slavery. And Lamy has branded himself very much as the descendant of Guyanan slaves and feels this very personally. But it's a real, we're talking about billions and billions of pounds, and and really not many people have done much thought about it. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, but before we move on, because I'm afraid we've got to, Josh, reparations for slavery. Then solve that one in the 15 to 20 seconds I can give you.
Well, it's just fundamentally very difficult 2 centuries later to do, and one also, I think, ought to take into account the fact that Britain did work quite hard to abolish slavery. But I do think that there are sort of diplomatic gestures that can be made to acknowledge the historical legacy of slavery to make sure it is on the agenda.
Well, that's going to be a big story the coming weeks, I'm sure. Look, thank you very much indeed, Josh Glancy, editor of the News Review at the Sunday Times, and Roger Boyes, diplomatic editor at the Times.